Hello, once again from St. Peter's Anglican Church here in Comox, British Columbia. I'm Alan Naylor. I'm the interim priest in charge here in the parish while the search goes on for a new rector for St. Peter's. Tomorrow is the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, and we have several deep readings which sort of need to be unpacked together. So I'm going to read a few verses from each of them. First up is the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now let's jump ahead in the readings to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you on my account. Rejoice, be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." And finally, from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, St. Paul writes, "The message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to many and foolishness to others. But to those who are the called, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." So that's the end of the readings. So what did you think about that last reading from Corinthians? The message of the cross, Paul says, is foolishness, God's foolishness, with which the wise of the world are shamed. And so by implication, we who walk in the way of Christ are part of this foolishness. How do you feel about being called foolish? Of course, no one likes to be thought of as a fool, even less called to be one. So you might be forgiven for listening to that with a slightly detached attitude. In fact, St. Paul, in that first chapter, refers 6 times in 10 verses to our faith as foolishness. The original Greek word used there is moros, from which we get the word moron. But in English, it's been rendered as foolishness. And the English word, fool, comes from the Latin follis, meaning a bag or a sack or a large inflated ball or a pair of bellows, due to the resemblance between that and a person who may be called a windbag or an airhead. None of which makes us feel any better about being called a fool by our adherence to the gospel. But the thing is that in this passage, St. Paul says that God called the church in Corinth, and by extension us, precisely because our faith makes us look foolish according to the world's standards. So we're all fools in this together. Well, not really. In our time, fools are people who, for one or other reason, are out of step with most others. They act differently, they don't conform to expectations. Fools have little status in our society. But in times past, they've had slightly different status. In the medieval world, right up to the 16 or 1700s, every monarch or ruler had a court jester known as the fool, whose job was to keep the ruler happy, to make them laugh when they were in bad humor, to lift their spirits. And those fools often gained a special closeness to their masters and mistresses, and they were able to use that to get away with saying things which others wouldn't have dared say, even criticizing the ruler's character or government and getting away with it. They had a unique freedom to talk about injustices and oppressions and any scandals. So they developed a strong tradition among the fools of being bold, speaking truth to power, as the saying goes. So while a fool may have been one who does not act in accordance with society's expectations, it's also someone who may have been free to comment on the failures of that society and on those who wield power in it. Well, that's not very different from the calling of people of faith. It's not too different from the calling of the church. God has not called us because of our knowledge or wisdom in the ways of the world, nor because we are powerful or well-born. We may in fact be some or all of those things, but that's not why God has called us to faith. God has called us because our faith makes us bold to speak and act on God's behalf in the midst of people and society. In other words, foolish in the old sense of that word. God has called us to be the ones whose lives point out the failures of the world's wisdom and power, and then go on to make a difference where there is suffering and violence. Of course, others of other faiths and others of no faith at all do that too. But in our case, we see it as a call from the divine. Which brings us to the other two readings I mentioned. You know, when the world looks at us who are foolish in faith, it sees, or it should see, people who live not according to the world's expectations, but people who, in those words of Micah which I read, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with their God. And who, in the words of Jesus, are meek, hungry for righteousness, merciful, pure in heart. Being all those things, doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly with God, being merciful and pure in heart. It doesn't require worldly wisdom or power or pride, but it does attract the attention of the world. Many see it as foolish and reject it out of hand as weak and unwise. Others might ask, why do we act this way? Why are we just and kind and humble? And we answer, because we are Christ followers, imitating his justice, his kindness, and his humility, in order that when people look at us, they will see what God looks like. And occasionally, the people who hear that answer realize that God has foolishly chosen them as well, foolishly remade them into the image of Christ, so that the world will see in their transformed lives the power and wisdom and love of God. So, you see, it's really not so bad being called a fool, after all. Amen. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. I pray God's richest blessings on you and on all those you love, today and always. Amen.